in the phrase, like the way I expressed it, which is incorrect, by the way, that the more spiritually aware person is responsible for the relationship, there is both the gift of saying, if I can see it, I'm responsible to address it. But there's also a sense of burden. Why am I responsible for this relationship? And so when I read the lecture again this time, I noticed a little magic phrase in front of that. And once again, I felt a little ashamed that I had forgotten this phrase. So I'm going to read it as written in the lecture. When people who are of uneven spiritual development are involved with one another, it is always the higher developed person who has the responsibility for the relationship. Now, why is that different from what I said? Because the premise in this statement is that the relationship is uneven. And later, the guide addresses relationships that are even. Now, the point here is this. If you are in a relationship where you are more spiritually developed than the other person, and that may not be a permanent situation, it may be an hour, a week, a month, a few years. If you are more spiritually aware than the other person, how could they possibly take responsibility for the spiritual growth in the relationship? They are part of the relationship, and they are responsible for having entered into it. But the trick here is that you, we are responsible for going into a relationship with someone who is not able to meet us on a developmental level. I'm trying to choose my words very, very carefully here because I do not wish to make a value judgment against the momentary developmental status of someone else. But there is a reality that if we can see something and the other person cannot see it because they are prejudiced or frightened or overwhelmed with emotion or biased, then the person who can see is responsible for sharing that information or seeing how that dynamic occurs in the relationship. So it's not that you are responsible for the other ever. You are not responsible for the other person. You are only responsible for yourself. But you are responsible for creating a relationship with someone who cannot always meet you on a developmental level. And if you make such a relationship, what the lecture is suggesting is that you accept responsibility for that. That you are a few steps ahead of the other person. It's a little bit like being taller than the other person. So someone who's 6 feet tall can see a little bit further over the hill or over the heads of the crowd. And a person who is 4.5 feet tall may have to depend on the vision of the taller person. It is that simple. Now, there are things the shorter person can do. Spiritually, they can grow up. Physically, we may not be able to do that. They can stand on a soapbox. They can climb a ladder. They can learn to interpret from sounds or information what might be going on. We can use our perceptive abilities to see further than perhaps our physical abilities are. But the sheer fact is that if we create a relationship with someone who is more advanced than we are, there's a reason for that relationship, both on the part of the person who is not as spiritually developed and on the part of the person who is more spiritually developed. So this statement, and I'll read it again, when people who are of uneven spiritual development are involved with one another, it is always the higher developed person who has the responsibility for the relationship. And then the guide says the lower developed person is not capable of such a self-search. Then there is the case where we have a relationship with someone who is our spiritual equal. And in that case, the guide says that it's not that we are both half responsible for the relationship, but that we are both fully responsible for the relationship. And what I interpret from that, because the guide's not always, the lecture is only 14 pages, it's not 50. What I interpret from that is that since life is never perfect and it's never in complete balance, what happens in relationship is that we go back and forth. That no two people are going to be perfectly developed on the same level at all times, growing at the same rate. So when the guide says, when people are equally spiritually developed, he does not mean tit for tat or in perfect balance. But the magic of a relationship is that we assist each other. When we can see, we take responsibility. And when the other person can see, they take responsibility for what they can see. They also take responsibility for sharing with the other and assisting them in their growth process. So I'm going to recap on this because, once again, when we read this lecture, some people hit that phrase and become upset about it. That if you are involved, and I want to use this instead of in the big R relationship, let's consider this on a small R relationship, on, for instance, a relationship with a neighbor. If you have a neighbor who is angry and upset all the time, and you are not angry and upset all the time, that person may bring to you a sense of dualistic thinking. This is wrong, that's wrong, I don't get my way, you're interfering with me, somebody hurt me. Ways of thinking dualistically, because that's why they're angry and upset, because they see the world as us and them and that they're not getting what they need. If you do not see the world that way, then you may be slightly or greatly more spiritually developed than that other person. That one of the things you can offer this other person is a lack of personal criticism, support for what they do well, to listen to them without encouraging them, and to find a place perhaps where you can be in relationship and not collude or enable aspects of their personality or their life that you see as negative. That in this sense, you may be more spiritually developed than the other, and you may need to watch out for the negativities that they ask you to engage in. This is what the guide is talking about when he talks about uneven relationships. But if we talk about, once again, small r, if we talk about a best friend relationship that works, it is more likely that you and your best friend are on a similar level of spiritual development. And sometimes they may feel down and depressed, and they may need support from you. And sometimes you may be down and depressed or angry and not quite understand what's going on, and they may be able to comfort you and give you insight into what might be happening. Or if nothing else, simply support you in your feelings. Again, without enabling or colluding with you. That this would be a relationship that would be more even. When we are in relationships where we are always helping the other and the other does not manage to be able to help ourselves, this is what the guide later describes as a relationship that becomes dysfunctional and eventually may need to end. It's not that you can't give all the time, but if you're in an intimate relationship and you are giving your time and effort and you are working on spiritual development and the other person is not, then the chances are the other person is not in a positive state. And at some point there will be some pressure, and that pressure may lead you to not grow yourself. And what the guide says is at that point, the relationship may need to end. It may need to terminate. Not because the other person is wrong, and not because the other person is bad, but because in relationship, if we are not able to grow, eventually the relationship could turn toxic. That are, once again, going back to the beginning, that our memories are of the unitive. our memories are of God and Spirit, that that's where we want to go. And to be cloistered in a relationship where growth is not possible, or there is so much drama that we cannot work on ourselves, we cannot work on our honesty, we cannot reveal our dishonesty because we're attacked for it, or it is colluded and encouraged to grow instead of encouraged to heal, then we won't be in a place where we can grow.